So welcome everyone. Really good to see you all here. So my name is Jesper, and we're going to have this session on assembly-based movements to overcome fascism. So this event is co-hosted between Revolution 21st Century, Assemble in the UK, and Resilient Uprising. And it's really good to be here. And I'm handing over to Roger.
Oh, is Michaela coming after me? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I thought someone else was speaking before me. Um, yeah. Do we need to have these slides on at the moment, or
No,
can we
we
take them
can
off?
we can take them off now. Thanks, Emma.
Yeah, okay. So, hello everyone. I am going to talk a bit about the bigger picture, and then we're going to hear from two or three different projects that dealing with assemblies, and also we're going to be communicating some general directions of travel in terms of building an international movement from Michaela and and this is very much the first sort of overview meeting, international meeting. As you probably many of you know, there's been conversations about assembly-based mobilising, and I'll talk more about what that means in a minute, around Western democracy in particular over the last 3 or 4 years, with a view to trying to create a new social coalition in many countries to deal with the far right and deal with the need for revitalised democracy. So this hasn't come out of anywhere. And I think a lot of groups have been going, well, we know someone in Portugal, we know someone, and all this is this sort of stuff has been happening. So really, we've been waiting for a sort of excuse to try and bring all our databases together and make a common database between several different organizations of the people who are interested in this general approach to revolutionary social change over the next 5 to 10 years. So this is definitely like a step forward, and we'll be talking a little bit more about how this becomes consolidated in a minute or two. So I don't need to sort of go through the whole palaver of the horrendous threats and terrible things that are coming down the line. But what I did want to do is just spend a little minute to maybe we can all settle ourselves and just acknowledge the amazing and hard work we're all doing at the moment. Because it's very easy to come into these sort of settings and suddenly go into some sort of slightly stressed headspace that all these bad things are happening and we've got to do something, and it's all a little bit fraught. I think it's really important to remind ourselves that we're doing this work as an end in itself because of who we are. And obviously, we're all going to work our bollocks off to try and make sure something good happens. But at the end of the day, we're doing the work because it's good in itself. And we need to sort of keep in touch with that sort of centering of ourselves. I'm sure many of you have various different, ways in which you do that, either as groups or as an individual. But I've started sort of reminding people of this at the beginning of sessions that I do because I just think it's important to remember who we are and what we do and why we're doing it. Okay, so on the basis of that little sort of reminder, yes, we do face horrendous threats and ruptures, which are now inevitably going to come down the line. And again, as many of you know, there has been a sort of general shift amongst movements and intellectuals and leftists and all the rest of it around many countries towards what is called many different things, but we might call it a social coalition, which is there to do two things. The first thing that it's there to do is obviously respond to the far right, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But also, like, it's not just a reactive a reactive project. You know, the far right are terrible. We need to do something about it. As we're all aware, we also need to and do have a positive vision of the future. And this positive vision of the future is not despite the ruptures, but because of the ruptures, there's going to be enormous opportunities to recreate and revitalize democracy in our countries along the lines of assemblies and the use of sortition, people being selected randomly rather than elections. So this is, I would venture to say, is really the main agenda for the revolutionary and radical movements around our countries over the next 5 to 10 years. And obviously, there's loads of ifs and buts I'm not going to go into because today's just going to give a little bit of an overview. But what I want to emphasize is this, you know, carrot and stick. There's terrible things coming down the line, but because these terrible things are coming down the line, we also have a massive opportunity to remake the world because remaking the world generally gets remade in times of crisis. And if this isn't a time of crisis, God knows what it is. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we create an international movement. And there's a big problem with thinking in a certain way where we go, oh, we need this, and it's very difficult to create this, and then we get stressed because we can't create this. What I want to sort of point us towards is this notion that all movements and all new social forms are iterative. In other words, after you've been on this call, you go and do something and then you'll iterate on it. In other words, it's not one thing or no thing. You start something small, you work on what was good about it and what was not so good about it, and then you go and do it again. So, in other words, it's a process. The second sort of big error is to think we either do this or that. So, I've started using this general formulation that we do everything all at once, and then we do everything all at once again in another iteration. So what we need to start creating our countries is what you might call timelines with lots of lines on them. And those lines arguably, I'm not saying this is the last word in the matter, but arguably are the following. One is mutual aid, which is communities coming together in order to support themselves as the far right becomes more powerful and as the ruptures affect the infrastructure of life, food, energy, housing, money, and such like. So we're all familiar with that. That's one major bucket. The second major bucket is campaigns. So these can be local campaigns, again, around housing or income or security issues or corruption. And these mobilize local people. And then the third bucket is elections and movement parties, which is where local communities and local groups combine together and then put candidates up. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about that particular bucket. Now, in terms of the strategy here, the whole point is that each of these three timelines, these three buckets, cannot thrive without the other two. That's the proposition. And I'm looking here for inspiration, possibly from the syndicalist movements of the 20th century, where you might say on Thursday night, you know, you go to your insurance mutual aid society, you know, to get security. On Saturday, you go on a demonstration against the far right, and you know, on Tuesday, you join your trade union meeting in order to go on strike. And all those three things are combined together: the elections, the civil resistance, and the mutual aid. And this is one of the big changes that we want to see. And, you know, everyone on this call needs to be part of this move, that we don't any longer stay within this neoliberal atomized bollocksy sort of, you know, bourgeois blah 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 thing where people have their little mutual aid group and their little campaign and their little elections, right? Everything needs to combine together. That does not emphatically mean we're returning to some sort of Leninist top-down, you know, five people in the country run everything. So all the intelligent thinking around the issues of process and movement building have this notion of close ecology or a similar concept. In other words, like these different elements are not atomized in a neoliberal way, but neither are they part of some sort of solid top-down situation. What they are in is a close ecology. And just as a little aside, this is something we're sort of developing in London at the moment, this notion that this close ecology concretizes itself around three areas. The first area is fundraising. So again, our neoliberal inheritance is everyone runs off on their own to go and get money. So we're moving towards the idea that you get 20 groups in the room with some big funders and you present them with a vision of social change as opposed to, I want 10, 20,000 for my little group. So that's the first concrete thing. The second concrete thing is combining campaigns. So when civil resistance happens or a strike happens or whatever, there's social solidarity across the space and coordination on that. And the third thing, obviously, is elections, so that the revolutionary and radical left combines together in order to do assembly-based mobilising, which leads to elections, which I'll speak to in a minute. In other words, there's not lots of different groups standing. There's only one or two people, who stand. So this starts to sort of concretise the lead up to, the big show, which is the revolutionary moments that are coming down the line, which leads to the sort of maybe the final sort of theoretical conundrum or political conundrum, which is this notion: are we creating movements that overcome capitalism, or are we creating movements that wait until capitalism crashes and then we go into the breach? So the obvious answer to that is both. In other words, we don't have time to wait for capitalism and the whole, system to start cracking. We need to push on as much as we can. And we need to be fully aware that it's very possible that we won't create mass movements until there are these major ruptures. And by major ruptures, I think we all know what that means, which is, ruptures to the extent that thousands of people die, including white people. And that's what's going to thrust the whole environment into a revolutionary space for obvious reasons, or at least in the global north, of course. Okay, so that's like the big picture. Okay, obviously, when we do all these trainings, we'll talk about these in more detail. I'm obviously like cutting lots of corners, but I'm just like setting the scene. And my aim here is so you don't go away from this, if this session going, oh, I know how to set up a little assembly in my town. That's not the plan. Okay, the plan is to be part of this mass movement and proactively make it happen. And the last thing I'll say is the idea here is, again, that the people on this call or the movements that exist are not in some hegemonic process of taking over the world, as and even when the mobilizations that we create bump into other mobilizations which are doing similar things, i.e. system change strategies, then the idea is, again, we grow into a close ecology with them and coordinate with them. So again, it's not an either them or us sort of situation. All right. All right. So all that sounds, all good, obviously. The main issue is what does this actually mean and what are the practicalities? So I'm going to sort of flip right down to the most basic processes that can start projects in localities. And I'm going to speak just for the next 5 minutes very briefly about what's happened in London, and try and draw out some, general principles. So arguably the biggest learning that we have to engage in is to understand that human beings do not mobilize through information, argument, debate, pressure, and such like. Human beings mobilize primarily through sociability. In other words, more concretely, being listened to. So I'm sure there's many people on this call who have done door knocking, and if you're good at door knocking, you know that the more you shut up and listen, the more people are willing to listen to you. And this is a big paradigm shift because the left for the last 200 years has got this bright idea that it knows what's going on in the world and it just has to go to the people and tell them, right? That's not going to work. It's going to be a disaster. It's been a disaster in the past and it will be a disaster in the future. So what we did in London, and arguably this is if you're coming on this call, thinking, what can I do? The obvious answer is you go out into your neighbourhood, into the working class suburbs, and you knock on doors and you say, hi, what are the good things that are happening in the neighbourhood and what are some of the not so good things that are happening? And as soon as you get to that conversation, that people will be off and away. And what we did in south part of London, in Brixton, was knock on 3 or 4 thousand doors and doing what was called a listening project. Now, the point of the listening project is it's basically a foundational baseline for the three buckets, whether it's elections or mutual aid or local campaigns. But through doing a listening project, you find out, as we did in Brixton, what the main issue was, which was homelessness. And then we set up a campaign around homelessness based upon doing assemblies. So when the door knocking happens, and again, there's variations on the theme, people are invited to community assemblies. At those community assemblies, we won't talk about it a lot now because there's other people who talk about it, but people split up into small groups and they decide, what their political identity is going to be through deliberation. And what we did in Brixton was that led to a housing campaign. I haven't got much time to talk about it now, but more importantly, in a way, then the housing campaign morphed into an election campaign. And the important data I want to share with you here is that we put up in wards, which are like 50 streets, 300 posters. We've got 20, 30 working class people to come to these assemblies because we put posters up, in flats and on bus stops. And at those assemblies, people chose their own candidates. And through the door knocking, we aggregated what the programme was going to be. So the basic principle here was the Syndicalist principle that the people within a geographical space choose their own candidate and their own programme. In other words, they have real hard power. And this, we're all standing on the shoulders of 150 years of syndicalist practice here. But basically, this is the point that political parties don't work because they choose the candidates themselves and they choose the programs themselves. Now, there's lots of details to discuss, but again, this is a big dividing line in terms of methodology. And the output was probably for the first time ever in London, all the candidates were chosen were working class and all the candidates came from migrant communities. So this is as opposed to the Green Party that, struggle to get 10 or 20% of people to from those demographics as part of their candidate list. So again, I'm not going to talk about it now, but you can hopefully see the potentiality here of mobilising working class or low middle class households around Western democracies, which has an impact on combating the far right. All right, so I'm slightly aware I'm going off over time, so I just want to finish with a few more sort of big ideas that spin out of this. So the first, there's two really big outputs from this process. The first one is we need to be really clear and have the explicit ambition that unless these movements take control of the state, then the far right will take control of the state. And as far as if we know that if the far right take control of the state in combination with major climate events, then we'll have a repetition of what happened in the 21st century. So it's essential that we mobilise with a view to taking control of the state as a way, of course, of then dissolving the state through assembly-based governments. In other words, citizens' assemblies, which are chosen by sortition that have legal powers. That's the concretisation of the revolutionary project. It's not just about putting posters on a wall. The second thing is this is only going to work in so much as we systematise ways in which we can train and then culture people into respectful ways of working together. Again, I'm not going to say loads about that, but the big social movements of the 20th century, for instance, in India and Brazil, were all based upon using, 50% of their resources to empower and train people. And training, therefore, is absolutely essential, along with fundraising, to sort of power these movements. All right. And I'm just going to throw in a last sort of wacky idea I've been talking to people this weekend is, as you may be aware, there's this sort of, transhuman singularity sort of narrative that is pervading, the Western world like a sort of shadow of Mordor, as you might say. And I think I'll throw in a sort of slightly wacky idea that what we have to do is create a human singularity. In other words, an assertion that the human, through coming together in deliberation, is capable of creating the flourishing society that we all want. And we're not here to dispense with the human, not least to a bunch of, big tech psychopaths, so that they can destroy the human and create this post-human future. So that all might sound a little bit science fictiony, but I would like to provoke everyone by saying I think that is probably the big two narratives of this century as we move into the big battles ahead. And yes, we are the hobbits, and we are going up against Mordor. So roll on Tolkien. I'll probably get in trouble for saying that. Anyway, good. I think that's enough from me. And thank you so much for coming along, everyone.
Thank you so much, Roger. I'll pass it over to you, Michele.
Yeah, thank you. I will try to be brief because I think the most important part is when there will be an explanation from people that has worked on this campaign for moving like working class people into the climate movement that has been done in Brixton. So myself, I'm Michele, I'm from Italy. I'm one of the co-founder of Ultima Generazione, which is a civil resistance organization in Italy. Now it's 5 years long. And now I'm working on starting together with Jesper and Roger here and Henrik, a new network organization. And I told you about this new network that wants to provide a connection, a place when the organization that want to follow the lines of the strategy that Roger talked about can meet and organize together. So we are at a good place. We have written a constitution together. We have made a process involving 60 activists and 7 months discussion so that it was really shared what we were talking about. And now we have a core team into which there are 9 people, and there are also a good representation of African activists so that we can really start like to be more global and not all European. So we hope that we can start soon. I know that we have said a lot of things, but as Jesper will tell you, there will be a follow-up meeting if you want to know more, you want us to answer questions, and you want to understand how to be involved with your organization in this new network. I want just to briefly summarize which are the main strategic points with this new network provides. And we have resumed those points in few bullet points that can be easily read. And we will send you them again to the email in the next days so that you can read it and understand if you agree and if you want to be part of trying to do this build move. And as Roger already said, but I will try to summarize, there are 3 major points into what we think that the climate movement should move. And of course, 4 major points. One of the major point is moving to material power. So building material power, not only symbolic media power. With material power, I mean owning resources that can help people in difficult situations so that you can build that long-term trust that changes society. The other point is that we want to move out from only civil disobedience and moving to mass non-cooperation campaigns. Mass non-cooperation campaigns are boycotts, disinvestment campaign from toxic bank, for instance, withdrawing from paying taxes. So we absolutely need to use what we already know to do, civil disobedience to elicit media attention, but we need to use that in order to be a spring that can go to mass non-cooperation. This is one of the major points. The second major point is that we need to create dual power. We need to enter popular neighborhood. We need to mobilize people around their issues. What does it mean? For instance, in Italy, one possibility, given the hot that is here, is that we should go in a popular neighborhood with our activist groups and provide help for people during that waves so that we can really meet popular people from working classes and then get them into assemblies so that they can organize themselves and they can gain more power. That's an example. And another thing, which is not mandatory to be part of our organization, but is possible, as Roger said, is using election as a means of gaining power for working class people around the climate and the social problems that are fundamental now. So I just want to make an example of a different approach that we can take. It's not started yet, but in Italy, we will do this in September with Ultima Generazione. We will do mass disinvestment campaign against banks that give money in fossil fuels and weapons. We will reinvest those money. So we will ask people not only to withdraw money, but to give money to ethical bankings and to mutual aid organizations that are already existing so that we can spread more money into the climate system and in the climate movement as fast as possible. And then we will use those money to create, to have more people working in popular neighborhoods so that they can help people during heat waves and gain popular people trust and move this trust from hide and mutual aid to political conflict, because we need to find some stable ways of growing and some mass way of growing, because the climate movement cannot spend its own entire life in cycles of action depression. It needs to find some sustainable way to keep growing. So Roger provided you an example, and there will be an explanation of what they did because they are already in place. I provide you another idea that we will start in September, and maybe in 8 months, we will provide you another example. So we are searching ways to enter working classes and create material power, because we need a long-term and fast and furious climate movement. So I really hope that you have some ideas, and we will share. Next meeting will be more collective because probably some of you is already doing something interesting. So it's nice, and I really hope to meet the most of you as soon as possible. Thank you. And I pass it to Jesper.
Thank you so much, Michele. So we're going to move into some case studies, and we're going to hear from Sam in the UK. Thank you so much, Sam.
Hello, nice to be here and see some of your familiar faces. I've seen some of you in trainings. I'm from Assemble, and I'm here in Devon in the UK. So yeah, I'm talking briefly about what we've been doing in Assemble. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to two different websites for you to have a gander at later on. But basically, we're a bunch of X in the right word, climate activists who've been at it for a long time. And then we're like, okay, something's not working. We need to do more. How can we reach outside of our bubble, our echo chamber? So Assemble was created to try and, as Roger described, create listening spaces so that we could hear from different people in our communities that we don't normally hear from, and create safe spaces for them to share. So that's what assemblies are all about, community assemblies. And we are basically Assembles in service to that process. So we don't mind who we're talking to, but like we're all about how can we empower people, normal people, with the agency and the skills and tools to bring around social change and specifically system change as well, right? We're obviously looking for political change. So what do I mean by that? Well, there was mention of dual power, and that word definitely resonates with me because we're looking at two different types of ways of doing it, but it's all about normal people taking part. So on a grassroots level, we're getting on with the job. We're not sort of demanding that the government do something and then sort of waiting around or anything. We're just like getting on with the job, no matter what, in the absence of their inability to get stuff done. Because we're running out of time. You all know that. I don't need to lecture on that side of things. So what do I mean in terms of dual power? So we're organising, or have been, we set up the first grassroots organised citizens assembly in the UK nationally, and that sat last year in the summer, July, a year ago, and we had 100 people selected by a sortition, and that meant that they're like a jury service, they're from all different walks of life, from across the country, different educational levels, different finance, and so on and so forth. And they came together and they discussed some of the top issues. Now, where did those top issues come from? The agenda was set by people's assemblies. Hundreds of people's assemblies happened the 8 months prior to that, across the country, where we invited people. People went out door knocking and talking to people in the streets and inviting them along to community event spaces where they could hear about, well, they could just talk and listen to each other, and share what they weren't happy about, what the government wasn't doing, and what was the top priorities. And we then collated all that information together, and some really obvious things came to the top again and again, kept repeating. And that created basically 5 key topics that then gave the agenda to the first sitting, the sortition selected citizens assembly that we organised last summer. So through that, they created the solutions informed by experts and deliberation, and the reports made by the people's assemblies. And by the end of the 3-day sitting that this 100 people sat and discussed, they came out the other side with 5 key solutions that they wanted to see enacted, and that became something called the People's Charter, which you can read more about on the House of the People website. And this institution, this alternative democratic grassroots organised institution, is running every year. So they will be running again later this year in November, where they'll be discussing this time AI. So it's, you know, really trying to address sort of like really contentious topics. What happened with the charter, you say? Where did it go? Well, for example, it created a legitimate, what's the word, manifesto for an organisation that you might have heard of called Take Back Power. So they took like one of the key top priorities forward, which was to tax the rich. So they have a street movement, piece of the pie. So that's what I mean by dual power. So they take on the civil disobedience campaign side of things, and have been running with that since early sometime last year. And meanwhile, we've been carrying on doing the grassroots stuff with the people's assemblies on the ground, community assemblies, and we've had various different things happening. So, you know, obviously this topic is about how do we address fascism. Well, obviously, if you don't know, in the UK, we have seen, you know, a huge rise with Nigel Farage, who's now facing off with a bin, I might add, and he's, you know, a sort of like right-wing reform politician going on. And so basically, we have now different local groups that are challenging that through a number of ways. So the first way is through putting up candidates in elections, and Roger spoke briefly to one of those called Shake It Up, and they had like I think over 6 candidates in one area in London that all stood in the elections in different wards, And so they're challenging as independents, and building campaigns through active listening campaigns through the assembly model. So that's that side of things. But other ways, for example, there were riots a couple of years ago in an area called Southport, and so people in Southport were like, we need to address this issue. So they had been holding assemblies as well to try and mitigate that division, because when you have spaces, whether that is a citizens assembly or a local assembly, whatever it is, when you create space for people to hear each other, it's really transformational. That's what we've learned over the last 2.5 years that we've been doing this. It absolutely is so transformational. People's minds are changed just by listening to one another and creating space, because they just want to be heard. A lot of people haven't been heard, and have been neglected by the state, and so on and so forth. So what's the other thing to say? The other case that I want to mention is mutual aid projects. So in Totnes area, we've had a series of 10 of these listening campaigns, assemblies happening over several months. And during that period, what came out of it naturally was wanting to set up these projects locally, mutual aid projects where people, there was a real issue around housing and stuff like that. So they were like, okay, how can we take that forward and tackle that? And so they're doing that bit of grassroots work at the moment. And yeah, so that's all systems go, and gives you a bit of context to what's happening on the ground here. And one more thing to say. Yes, okay, so the other thing is, obviously, we know that there are so many different crises coming up. We can't predict them, but what we can do is prepare and plan for the worst. And that means having decision-making, democratic spaces in our local community. That network is going to be so key when shit hits the fan, right? So we need to practice that process now and get everyone ready for it, regardless of what comes next, because there are many things on the horizon. It's going in so many different ways very, very quickly. And so this is, in my world, my insurance policy of how I can help protect my community, and do that deep work now before things get out of hand. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that helps. As I said, we offer online trainings, so you can check out the website, but we've got some offerings later on that will come up for you guys to learn more if you're interested. And that's it. Yeah, pass back to Jessica.
Thank you so much, Sam. Yeah, it's so good to hear what's happening in Italy, what's happening in the UK, and how it's all kind of weaving together in our different contexts, and still some underlying dynamics and principles that we are working with. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Andy in Australia, which is getting ready for 5 a.m. And it's been so good to work with you, Andy, over the and have contact over the last 4 years, and how we're learning from each other across geographical conditions and space and time. And so good that you could join, even though it's super early for you. Thanks,
Oh, well,
Andy.
I see another person who's very early. Param is also early bird in Australia at 4 a.m. G'day, Param. Well, I think it's been very interesting to see all the synthesis of ideas and experience in what everyone has said so far into like what I guess through our working together, we've been pushing in a similar direction. But like moving on what Sam was just saying about assemblies and community governance and knowing people as like an insurance policy, I couldn't agree more. So I might start a little bit in the past and then move to the present. But I did spend 3.5 years in the area in northern New South Wales, which was hit by a catastrophic flood, like 2 meters higher than anything before, in a very floody area, and thousands of houses were inundated. And let's just go to the good news briefly. Community response during disasters is awesome. Uh, People called it glorious anarchism, as a very diverse regional area sort of supported each other, you know, businesses supporting people and people supporting people and literally rescuing people when the institutions were like, it's too dangerous. Our bureaucracy was holding people back from going out in boats to rescue people. So the whole area mobilized with speedboats and kayaks and rescued people from roofs. Um, but then what happened, very briefly, is the second disaster is the government response is top-down dominating decision making and a system that doesn't trust people and doesn't even know how to listen to people. And this is pretty much the recipe of disasters in Australia and probably around the world. I recommend Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell, to get a sense of optimism and history around how communities are amazing in disasters. But we, as like a volunteer in service to the community there, trying to face climate disasters rather than getting arrested on the streets in cities, there was a group called Reclaim Our Recovery that I joined there, and we tried to be this voice. We recognized that the government wasn't listening to people. We recognized that they faced a massive dilemma, which needed a citizens' assembly at the very least to come up with solutions. And so we gradually created this thing called the Lismore People's Assembly, and brought like working class people together to be listened to, and have a chance to say what they needed from this recovery. And like it pretty much was very, very hard to have traction with those in power, on the one hand. And that kind of reinforces to me this synthesis of when you're working with the community and campaigning, you do need to think about where the formal power lies and how to try and take some of that in this time. And the other thing that came up is we did more assemblies on housing and as well, because that's just such an intersecting issue when all these houses got destroyed and the government actually has been demolishing houses rather than relocating them, for example, that they could be doing. But it's this issue of like power in this assembly really came up because as much as people appreciate talking and it's very liberatory and amazing thing to do, if you don't have the organizational capacity to follow through with the ideas that people are generating, or some institutional relationships to try and get traction, then you do slightly risk this talk fest narrative or experience. But it mostly comes back to like capacity to do something with these people together. Where are we going to go next? So what Michele is raising about how we're resourced as movements is really important. And I think one innovation option here is like community banking, where we put a bit of money in each week, and then when we have assemblies as a community, we have $1,000 or $10,000 or whatever to actually do something with it as a way we can sort of create some self-fund, some energy to move our ideas into action. But basically, the experience from Lismore is like if we had an assembly and an institution and experience in organizing together uh, before the disaster, then we might have had a better chance to um, maintain more power after the disaster. But of course, it's quite complex because there was a huge, uh, strong community in that area. And there's this question of why didn't it go better in some ways? And I think ultimately, to cut it short, it comes back to solidarity, because people who were most impacted were the lower socioeconomic people on the floodplain. And this area has a great history of community organizing, and that energy sort of dispersed in many directions, but also ultimately, I think the solidarity wasn't perhaps there as much as it needs to be in these like really harsh, challenging times we face. And I think the reason why this is so important is because of our interconnectedness as a society and as humans. And it comes back to doing this work of door knocking and wanting to create empower people and liberate people and work in marginalized areas because, as Roger said, it really rings in my head. If we don't door knock on the working class suburbs, they will vote for the far right. If people who are already marginalized get smashed by a disaster, I've met people who are they work for the council part-time and they pay more tax than the billionaires, and they are having a very the fabric of their street neighborhoods has broken down because of this flood, and it's really tragic. And this is where people, go towards more conspiratorial thinking. All these things is interconnected um, with people getting more oppressed by situations, and that oppression will come around if people vote for the far right, for example. So I think, yeah, probably I'll just very briefly touch on what is now happening. So move back to the big city. We face compounding scenarios of a massive rollout in data centers across the outer suburbs in Melbourne, plus a rollout of waste to energy incinerators, which I gather parts of Europe have kind of banned, but Australia, a few decades behind the time, is trying to build them. And so once again, these are far away from sort of privileged inner suburbs where I am living, but I see that this is about being in solidarity and seeing the brotherhood with people who are exposed to, for example, these incinerators that have, toxic implications. But we're in super exciting times here. We've got a project about to launch, but basically we're in a synthesis, a whirlwind of organic campaigning against these place-based personal threat issues. We have an election coming up at the end of November. We already have this system of community independence that is kind of okay, but not designed in assemblies. And so I'm working with them to encourage the use of assemblies as the process to find candidates and stuff like this. But yeah, kind of watch this space. And lastly, very lastly, coming from somewhere that experiences hectic disasters, but I know everyone does, there is something very empowering and important in terms of this insurance policy Sam mentioned to start on our own streets, even if it's not the most marginalized area. Those relationships, I think, are key as well for us to have some resilience. And it also feeds into these other systems, potentially with resources, with people who are able to get involved in projects in other areas. And I've been door knocking in the incinerator area, in the AI data center area, and on my street. And every time I feel so excited by life after talking with people and hearing, people are how good people are, and we're all on the same page pretty much, and we just have to keep organized. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's so good how we're learning across from each other in this way, and that's really what we want to do and what we need, and that's also why we're having this call. For those who are football fans and the World Championship final game is starting in 7 minutes. We're going to do a breakout room for 12 minutes, so you'll just miss maybe 1 or 2 minutes, or maybe you can have it on in another way at the same time. So if you're not staying for that, you have the link now in the chat for the upcoming sessions and trainings that you can read more there. So basically Sunday next week is we're going to do similar to this. So if there's other people in your organization or in your network that you think like, this would be really something good for them, then bring a friend, bring a colleague next Sunday. And then we have the two other ones are the trainings. Going to speak more about that. But now really important is that we get to speak to each other and get to know each other. So we're going to have 12 minutes in smaller groups of about 4 or 5 people, where you can take a round and and reflect together. Like, what do you think about what you just heard and what you plan to do next? And then we'll come back and we'll speak more about the upcoming trainings and an international conference that we're doing at the end of September. So Emma, if you're ready, please, you can open the rooms. So welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you had some good conversations. And if there's anything you want to share with the rest, please put it in the chat. Any takeaways, anything that you feel you want to share, just put it in the chat. So we'll be rounding up in about 10-15 minutes. So Emma, would you be able to share the slides starting on the third one, and I can do the links and such. Thank you. All right, so what's upcoming now? Next Sunday on a more friendly time for people in Australia or people who are busy who registered. We had more than 50% more people who registered who could maybe do with another time. So we're going to have a similar session also with more Q&A time with Michele, who you saw earlier, and also with myself next Sunday. And I'm just gonna post the link to this, and all the links to registration for any of the upcoming trainings is on the same page, so you can just find it in the same place. So yeah, if you found it interesting tonight, then do share it with other people in your network, and that would be awesome. And if you can click on the next slide, Emma. And then in a bit less than a month, we're going to have a training run by Assemble on the 16th of August. We're going to have also one that is earlier in the morning that also works with people in Australia and New Zealand, and then we're going to have one in the evening. So there's going to be a dual session on how to run assemblies. Do you want to say any couple of words, Roger or Sam, about that?
Yeah, sure, I can. It will just give you like I guess a crash course 101, how to run assemblies, what the things, when you're organizing one, what the key things you need to think about, get skilled up in, and that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's like your one-stop shop to get up to speed on all that kind of things.
Fantastic. And if we can go to the next slide, and Roger, if you want to speak on the assembly-based election campaigns, just a minute.
Yes, so this will focus, as I've mentioned when I spoke before, on the case study of mobilising people in Brixton. So this started off with literally 3 people, including myself, going door knocking, and 8 months later, there was a big election campaign that got around 50% name recognition and 100 people campaigning, knocking on 20,000 doors. So the real takeaway here is you can start very small, 3 or 4 people in a city or a town, and 6-8 months later, you can be a major sort of entity in that geographical space that's promoting these methodologies around mutual aid campaigns and elections. So we'll look at that in more detail and how projects around the country, around the world can get funded, because there's going to be hopefully a lot more funding for this, particularly as it becomes more evident that this is a major module activity that can help prevent the rise of the far right.
Thank you so much, Roger. So if we can end the slides, Emma, thanks. So the two, we're going to speak shortly about the international conference. So we're working and setting up a conference at the end of September. I just posted a form where you can sign your interest, and it's basically going to be with projects from around Europe and maybe further than that, coming together like we did in London in March to speak about how can we build this material power through assemblies, through different models, and hopefully also we're going to get some people who are doing really cool projects outside of our sphere who are also going to come and show us the ropes on what they have done to build that capacity we need to really do our part. So that's that, and you're going to get more information over email. And then lastly, I just wanted to share a little snippet where you can get a bit more into the theory of change and the thinking behind this new network from the gathering we had in March in London, where Michele, who you heard earlier, speaks for about 25 minutes, where he compares how the MAGA system is operating and what is it that we need to do that caters for different aspects of a systemic change. So that's unlisted, so it's just for everyone who's here. And with that, I don't have anything more we need to say. Is there any last words you want to give, Roger, before we close?
Yes, I did want to say, like on a practical note, I think it's super important that everyone who isn't making a start makes a start because, as you just heard, what we did in Brixton initially involved 3 people. So the beauty of this process is we're thinking about the big picture, but we're also thinking about how you can start listening projects which give birth to the other projects, and this can happen anywhere. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it's super important that people network within these networks that presently exist, so that we can do more extensive trainings after September. So these 2 trainings are very much just taster trainings. And obviously, as I said, as we bump into other people who are doing similar things and doing things better than us, then we'll integrate the trainings into larger training programs. And the last thing is the good news is there is a major crisis going on in terms of how we're going to deal with the far right. And this is leading to a lot more people being willing to give significant amounts of funding for projects that look like they can enable communities to resist the far right. We've raised £500,000 in the UK recently for some projects, and we've got expectations of raising that again this September. So if the way we're going to raise lots of money and we're going to create a solid infrastructure is for you not to go away from this call and go, oh, that's great for my little group or that's great for my little project. We all need to combine our credibilities together so we can learn from each other. We're not saying the modules of activity we've got are in any way the final objective way to do things. We're saying it's good enough to go way of doing stuff. So please do maintain connections with, the connections that Jesper's provided, or get in touch with us, and we can start holding more specific network meetings in different areas, in different countries and such like. And whenever you've got an election, then we need to stand in the elections. No pressure. All right. Yeah, so that's my practicalities. Obviously, thanks so much for everyone for coming along, and we'll wait expectantly for 3,000-person Zoom calls when it goes over 1.7 next year. What more can I say? I'll leave on that note.
Thank you so much, Roger. So inviting everyone to unmute, and then we'll be on our way. Thank you so much, everyone.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Guys,
Thank
for
you.
coming.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
you.
Keep it
Bye.
going.
Thank
Keep it
you.
going.
Bye.
Bye.
Oops.